They were supposed to be protectors, their children's first love, their ultimate shelter. But behind the nursery doors and family photo smiles, a darker story was unfolding. What drives a mother, the very symbol of life and nurture, to take that life away? From chilling bathtub confessions to manipulative courtroom smiles, this is the side of parenthood no one talks about, the murders no one wants to believe. These aren't just crimes, they're psychological storms, unraveling everything we think we know about motherhood, mental illness, and the thin line between love and horror. They were the picture of a devout American family, Andrea Yates, a nurse turned full-time mother, and her husband Rusty, a NASA engineer with a steady career and a dream of building a God-fearing household. Their modest Houston home held 5 young children, all born within a span of 7 years, their names echoing the scriptures: Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. By every external appearance, they were a family of discipline and love, living a life rooted in deep religious conviction and traditional roles. But beneath that surface, a mental storm had begun to brew, a silent, creeping descent into a dark world where delusion blurred reality, and motherhood became a prison of impossible expectations. Andrea was always shy, reserved, and highly intelligent. A former valedictorian and nurse, she held herself to standards most could never reach. But as she bore child after child, often with little recovery time or support, the cracks began to widen. She suffered from severe postpartum depression after the birth of her 4th child and later experienced her first psychotic break. She reported hearing voices, seeing visions of knives and blood, and felt convinced that she was marked by Satan. Her psychiatrist urged immediate medication and hospitalization, but Rusty, guided by a deeply conservative religious mentor named Michael Warnicki, believed in spiritual warfare over psychiatric care. The family withdrew further into religious isolation, throwing out the television, homeschooling the children, and cutting off worldly influences. Andrea's mental state deteriorated rapidly. She had a known history of psychosis, suicide attempts, and even a documented episode where she held a knife to her own neck. Still, Rusty insisted on having more children, believing they were fulfilling a divine plan. Andrea gave birth to their 5th child, Mary, despite her doctor's warnings that more pregnancies could lead to irreversible psychosis. And then came the moment that no one, least of all those 5 innocent children, could ever have imagined. On June 20, 2001, just moments after Rusty left for work, Andrea walked calmly into the bathroom where her children were playing. With grim precision, she filled the bathtub with cold water, gripped each child by the arm, and one by one, she drowned them. Noah, her eldest, struggled. He ran. He saw his siblings floating, lifeless. But Andrea chased him down and submerged him too. She then laid all 5 children on the bed, gently, methodically, as if preparing them for sleep. Then she called 911 and confessed. The world was stunned, not just by the horrific nature of the crime, but by the calm, emotionless delivery of her confession. Andrea said she killed them to save their souls from eternal damnation, convinced that Satan had taken hold of her mind and that if she didn't act, her children would be doomed. Her case split the nation. Was she a monster or a mother lost in a sea of untreated mental illness? The prosecution painted her as cold and calculated, but the defense highlighted her years of documented psychosis, delusions, and failed psychiatric intervention. The media fixated on her appearance, her hollow eyes, emotionless face, and ghost-like manner in court. The jury convicted her of capital murder, sentencing her to life in prison. But a retrial was granted years later when it was revealed that a state witness had falsely claimed she got the idea from a TV show that never aired. This time, the verdict was not guilty by reason of insanity, and Andrea was committed to a mental hospital, where she remains today. Her story opened a national conversation about postpartum psychosis, mental health and motherhood, and the dangers of mixing religious fundamentalism with psychiatric neglect. Mothers are often romanticized as tireless caregivers, but Andrea Yates shattered that image, revealing a terrifying truth, that even the most devoted mother, when left untreated and unheard, can fall so deeply into darkness that love becomes indistinguishable from death. Her case wasn't just about murder, it was about silence. The silence of a husband who ignored red flags, the silence of a system that sent her home too soon, and the silence of a society that demands perfection from mothers while offering them no safety net when they break. What would have happened if someone had truly listened to Andrea before June 20th? What if postpartum psychosis was treated with the same urgency as physical illness? What if faith and science had worked together, instead of pulling her apart? These questions still haunt us today, as we struggle to reconcile the unbearable image of a mother who killed with the haunting possibility that she might also have been a victim of biology, belief, and brutal neglect. The morning of June 20th, 2001, unfolded like any other humid summer day in Houston, Texas, but within the Yates home, it would become a scene of unthinkable horror. After Rusty Yates left for work at 9 a.m., he left behind a wife on the brink of psychological collapse, alone with 5 young children. Despite a psychiatrist's clear warning just weeks earlier, Andrea should never be left unattended with the kids. But Rusty, steadfast in his belief that prayer and discipline could overcome mental demons, chose not to listen. That decision sealed the fate of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary. Within an hour, Andrea filled the bathtub, not out of maternal routine, but with deadly intent. She started with Paul, just 3 years old, lifting his fragile body into the tub and holding him beneath the water. He struggled, gasped, and finally went still. Next came Luke, 2 years old, whose tiny arms flailed before going limp. Then John, age 5. Then Mary, just 6 months old, still in diapers. Lastly, Noah, the oldest at 7, who walked in and saw his sister's lifeless form in the tub. Realizing something was terribly wrong, he tried to run. Andrea chased him through the house, dragged him back, and held him under as he thrashed, screamed, and pleaded for his life. This was no frenzied act, it was cold, calculated, and methodical, exactly what would become central in the courtroom debate. After drying off her children, she laid them on the bed, their arms crossed, their faces peaceful. Then she called 911 and her husband, stating flatly, "You need to come home. It's time." When police arrived, Andrea met them at the door with no tears, no resistance, no remorse, just eerie stillness. Her calm confession stunned investigators. She told them she had killed her children to save them from eternal damnation. She believed Satan had possessed her, and that if she didn't act, her children would be forever corrupted and dragged to hell. This religious delusion was deeply rooted in years of spiritual extremism, fueled by cult-like teachings from Michael Warnicki, a former traveling preacher who taught that women were wicked, that birth control was sinful, and that motherhood was a sacred test of salvation. Andrea had internalized these beliefs to a dangerous degree. She told doctors that she had waited for the perfect moment to commit the murders, when she was alone, unobserved, and knew she could finish the task before anyone interrupted her. The prosecution latched onto this, arguing that her premeditation, planning, and execution showed sanity, not insanity. The case ignited a national firestorm. Could a woman who planned so precisely be deemed insane? Was religious extremism a valid excuse? Did the American mental health system fail her, or did she choose evil, fully aware of her actions? The defense brought in expert psychiatrists who diagnosed Andrea with severe postpartum psychosis, a rare but dangerous mental illness that can emerge after childbirth, characterized by delusions, hallucinations, and break from reality. They testified that Andrea truly believed she was doing God's will, and that she thought killing her children was the only way to save them. Her earlier suicide attempts, hospitalizations, and chilling journals were introduced as evidence. Andrea had written of voices telling her she was a bad mother and that her children were doomed. She believed cartoons on TV were sending her secret messages and that her sons were beginning to show signs of demonic possession. Still, the jury struggled. Andrea's emotionless expression in court unsettled them. When shown photos of her dead children, she didn't cry. Some jurors mistook this as coldness, not understanding that such flat affect is a hallmark of psychosis and catatonia. Meanwhile, the prosecution delivered a blistering argument. Andrea waited for her husband to leave, locked the dog up to avoid interference, and drowned each child with intent, not in a fit of temporary madness. They claimed her actions were those of a calculating killer, not a delusional mother. The first trial ended in a conviction, guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. But years later, her case was overturned when it was revealed that a state expert falsely testified she had gotten the idea from a Law and Order episode, a show that, in fact, did not exist. That lie undermined the state's credibility, and Andrea was retried. This time, with clearer understanding of postpartum psychosis, a new jury found her not guilty by reason of insanity. She was sent to a state mental hospital, where she remains to this day. She is heavily medicated, stable, and devotes her time to painting and quietly reading the Bible. She receives no visitors, not even Rusty, who eventually divorced her and remarried. He now has a new family, while Andrea lives in a small, locked psychiatric ward with no access to children or the outside world. Her story continues to divide America. Some view her as a monster who escaped justice. Others see her as a tragic symbol of what happens when mental illness is ignored, untreated, and punished instead of helped. In the wake of her case, several states pushed to expand postpartum care, increase awareness of perinatal mental health disorders, and create diversion programs for women in crisis. But the deeper wounds, those cut into the national psyche, remain raw. Andrea Yates challenges everything we believe about motherhood. We want mothers to be nurturing, selfless, infallible. But what happens when biology and belief collide? When a woman's brain becomes her battlefield, and the children she would die for become the ones she kills to save? There are no easy answers. Just grief. Just questions. Just a tragic reminder that mental illness doesn't always look like screaming in the streets. It can look like quiet obedience, like folded laundry, like a mother kissing her baby before holding her under the water. Andrea's case forces us to look inward, at our systems, our stigmas, and our silence. And it leaves us wondering, how many more mothers are drowning in their own minds, right now, unseen? It was a spring night in 1983 when Diane Downs pulled into the emergency bay of Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon, honking frantically, shouting that her children had been shot. Her red Nissan was splattered with blood. Cheryl, age 7, was already dead. Christy, age 8, was barely breathing, her tiny body riddled with bullets. Danny, just 3, had been paralyzed from the waist down. The nurses and doctors rushed into action, performing emergency procedures, desperate to save what little life remained in those broken bodies. Diane, meanwhile, stood calmly by, her demeanor strangely devoid of maternal panic. Her story, delivered with an unsettling steadiness, was that a shaggy-haired stranger had flagged her car down on a rural road, demanded her keys, and opened fire when she refused. But police noticed almost immediately that things didn't add up: the way she spoke in past tense about her children, the coldness in her eyes, and the suspiciously bloodless gunshot wound on her own arm, which she claimed to have received in the scuffle. Diane Downs, it would soon be discovered, was not the victim of a random act of violence. She was the shooter, and the motive, as chilling as it was absurd, boiled down to something heartbreakingly simple: love. Not maternal love, but romantic obsession, an infatuation with a married man named Robert Knickerbocker, who had told her in no uncertain terms that he did not want children in his life. To Diane, the solution was clear. If the children were no longer in the picture, her lover would have no excuse not to be with her. This twisted logic was the product of a deeply narcissistic and manipulative mind, one that had long masked a well of darkness behind bright lipstick and flirtatious smiles. Diane had always portrayed herself as charming and confident, but her past revealed patterns of attention-seeking, impulsivity, and a disturbing lack of empathy. She had run away from home as a teenager, had multiple affairs during her marriage, and once claimed she'd been a surrogate for a child simply because she liked being pregnant. In truth, her maternal instincts were warped, transactional, and void of emotional depth. To Diane, children were accessories, leverage for relationships, tools for manipulation, pawns in the game of her ego. The night of the shooting, she had taken the kids for a drive after dinner, something seemingly harmless and routine. But her route was deliberate, her mind already made up. She pulled over on a dark country road, turned to her children, and fired 5 bullets into their small bodies. Cheryl, the eldest and perhaps the most defiant, took the worst of it. Christy, miraculously, survived but suffered a stroke that impaired her speech. Danny would never walk again. Diane shot herself in the arm afterward to stage the story, then drove to the hospital at a calculated speed, too slow to be the frantic rush of a desperate mother, too fast to arouse suspicion, but slow enough to ensure Cheryl would bleed out before arrival. When questioned by police, her statements were inconsistent. She smiled inappropriately, flirted with investigators, and showed more concern for her car than her children. When asked if she cried after the attack, she said no, claiming she didn't want to ruin her makeup. But it was during Christy's recovery that the truth began to fully unravel. Despite her physical impairments, Christy regained partial speech and, in a moment of profound courage, told the court what really happened: her mother had pulled the trigger. The courtroom erupted in shock, and Diane's fate was sealed. But even then, she refused to admit guilt. She gave television interviews where she smiled, shrugged, and spoke about the events as if recounting a minor inconvenience. She wore tight skirts and red blouses to court, seemingly enjoying the attention, even while on trial for the attempted murder of her own children. The media dubbed her the sexy psychopath, and public fascination with her case exploded. The image of a mother killing her children for a man was too grotesque to ignore, and Diane's lack of remorse only deepened the horror. Her behavior became increasingly erratic. At one point she claimed a new name, told reporters she was pregnant again, which turned out to be true, and even gave birth while awaiting trial. The father was a casual fling, the pregnancy a calculated move to appear more sympathetic to the jury. But it didn't work. In 1984, she was convicted of murder and attempted murder, sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. She was deemed a danger to society and her own offspring, and the judge made it clear she would never be eligible for parole. Her surviving children, Christy and Danny, were adopted by the prosecutor and his wife, a detail that would become a powerful symbol of justice triumphing over evil. Diane's story, while singular in its audacity, tapped into a deeper societal fear that the archetype of the nurturing mother could be nothing more than a mask. Her case became a national obsession not just because of the crime, but because of the psychological inversion it represented. How could someone so biologically bound to protect do something so monstrous? Her narcissistic personality disorder, diagnosed later by mental health experts, explained much: her need for admiration, her lack of empathy, and her pathological lying. But even with that explanation, the emotional weight of her crime lingered. It raised uncomfortable questions about motherhood, mental illness, and the capacity for manipulation within the most sacred of relationships. Diane Downs became an icon of maternal betrayal, a woman who weaponized motherhood to pursue a fantasy, leaving behind broken bodies, shattered trust, and a national audience still trying to make sense of it all. The trial of Diane Downs was not just a legal proceeding, it was a psychological excavation, a slow, methodical unearthing of the lies, motives, and pathology of a woman whose own daughter had pointed a trembling finger at her in court. From the very beginning, the prosecution painted Diane as a master manipulator, a woman who used her sexuality and charm as tools of deceit, twisting reality to suit her personal fantasies. The courtroom was packed every day, not just with legal professionals and media but with ordinary Americans captivated by the twisted paradox of a mother who turned against her own blood. The evidence was damning. The forensic analysis revealed no signs of struggle with the so-called bushy-haired stranger. The bullets removed from the children's bodies matched the caliber of Diane's handgun, a weapon she had conveniently reported missing. No shell casings were found at the supposed crime scene, yet one was found inside her car. There were no tire tracks, no footprints from a fleeing assailant. It was clear, the crime scene existed only in Diane's mind, a fiction constructed to absolve her of guilt and place herself back in the role of victim. But the most devastating blow came when Christy Downs, then just 9 years old and still recovering from a stroke that had impaired her speech, took the stand. She struggled through tears, pausing to breathe between broken words, as she told the court what had haunted her every day since the shooting, that her mother had done it. That her mother had pointed a gun at them and pulled the trigger. There was a silence in the courtroom as her words landed, not just a factual confirmation of what the prosecution had built their case on, but an emotional dagger that cut through every excuse Diane had offered. Still, Diane refused to admit guilt. She smiled during breaks, rolled her eyes at testimony, and carried herself with the bizarre self-confidence of someone who believed she could outsmart everyone. She gave interviews from jail, telling journalists that the media had it all wrong, that she loved her children, that she was the true victim of a frame-up. But her behavior only made her seem more detached, more dangerous. She became pregnant during the investigation, some said deliberately, to evoke public sympathy or perhaps to reset the narrative around her motherhood. The pregnancy was successful, and she gave birth to a girl while awaiting trial. The baby, later named Rebecca Babcock, was adopted and would grow up to grapple with the horrific truth of her biological mother's legacy. As the trial progressed, psychologists were brought in to explain Diane's mental state. She was diagnosed with narcissistic personality disorder, a condition marked by grandiosity, an insatiable need for attention, and a shocking lack of empathy. Her actions, they argued, stemmed from a delusion of self-importance, where her desires eclipsed the value of human life, even that of her own children. The diagnosis offered some clarity, but it did not excuse. Jurors were visibly disturbed by her demeanor, her shifting stories, and her tendency to speak in circles when asked direct questions. It wasn't just what Diane had done, it was how unaffected she appeared in the face of it. She spoke about the children's injuries with a detachment that was more chilling than any photograph. She said of Cheryl's death, "It happened," as if narrating a flat, distant memory. She spoke of her surviving children in the past tense, as if they had become inconvenient footnotes in her pursuit of romantic fulfillment. The jury deliberated for just 36 hours before returning a verdict, guilty on all counts. The judge, in one of the most scathing rebukes ever heard in an Oregon courtroom, sentenced her to life in prison plus 50 years. The court finds that you are a danger to society, to your own children, and to any child you might ever come into contact with, he said. You will never leave prison. Not ever. Diane was transported to the Oregon Women's Correctional Center, and though the prison bars closed behind her, her story refused to be locked away. Over the years, she became a figure of fascination and horror in equal measure. True crime shows, documentaries, and dramatized films featured her case, each trying to dissect what could possibly drive a mother to kill. Diane granted multiple interviews over the decades, each more bizarre than the last. In one, she claimed that her children had been abducted by a government conspiracy. In another, she insisted that her daughter Christy had been hypnotized into falsely accusing her. She continued to deny any involvement in the shootings, even as the forensic evidence, the eyewitness testimony, and the basic facts all contradicted her. Inside prison, Diane maintained a sense of superiority. Inmates described her as controlling, narcissistic, and manipulative. She often spoke about her case as if she were the heroine of a tragic story wronged by the justice system. She studied law, filed her own appeals, and even tried to gain custody of her youngest daughter from behind bars. All were denied. Her two surviving children, Christy and Danny, were adopted by Fred Hughey, the lead prosecutor in the case, and his wife Joanne. They were given new names, a new home, and a chance at a life free from Diane's influence. But the scars remained. Christy would later speak publicly, expressing the pain of betrayal, the terror of testifying against her own mother, and the lifelong process of healing from trauma that no child should endure. Danny, paralyzed from the waist down, grew up into a resilient and kind man, his strength a living counter-narrative to the cruelty that had tried to define him. As for Rebecca, the daughter born after the crime, her journey was one of confusion, identity struggles, and eventual reckoning. Learning that your mother is one of the most notorious child killers in American history is a burden few can imagine. She appeared in interviews years later, candidly sharing the emotional complexity of her lineage, simultaneously rejecting Diane and trying to understand how someone capable of such horror could also be part of her DNA. Diane Downs remains incarcerated to this day. She has applied for parole multiple times, each time insisting she is innocent, each time rejected. The parole board has described her as narcissistic, self-serving, and lacking insight. Her own words betray her. If I had shot my children, would I not have lost my mind? She once asked rhetorically in an interview. Would I not have gone crazy at the hospital? But that is precisely what makes Diane so terrifying, not that she went mad, but that she was lucid, methodical, and eerily calm in the wake of unspeakable violence. Her story, like that of Andrea Yates, forces us to confront the darkest possibilities of motherhood. But where Andrea's tragedy was born of untreated psychosis, Diane's was driven by cold ambition, vanity, and a chilling detachment. She didn't kill because she broke, she killed because she wanted something more. Something better, in her own mind. And her children were simply in the way. In the decades since her conviction, the name Diane Downs has become shorthand for maternal betrayal. She stands as a stark, haunting reminder that evil doesn't always come in the form of a shadowy stranger on a dark road. Sometimes, it smiles from the driver's seat, with a loaded gun tucked beneath a blanket and children strapped into the back seat, trusting, unaware, and heartbreakingly vulnerable. On a crisp October evening in 1994, Susan Smith made a frantic call to 911 from her home in Union, South Carolina, her voice shaking with horror as she claimed that a black man had carjacked her vehicle at a traffic light and driven off with her 2 young sons still strapped in their car seats. The children, 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex, had vanished into the night, and so began one of the most widely publicized missing children cases in American history. With the face of a distraught mother and trembling lips that quivered as cameras flashed, Susan became the focal point of a frenzied national manhunt. Her plea was televised across the country, and Americans from every corner of the nation rallied to help find the boys. Candlelight vigils were held. Posters were printed by the thousands. News anchors wept on air. Celebrities offered support. But behind Susan's doe-eyed grief and tearful public appeals was a lie so calculated, so deeply manipulative, that it would shatter the nation's collective heart. For 9 days, she maintained her story with precision, describing her fictitious assailant as a young African-American man in a knit cap, spinning a tale that played directly into the racial fears and biases of America's psyche. Police followed every lead. Dozens of innocent black men were questioned, some publicly scrutinized without evidence. Susan wept in front of news cameras, clutched photographs of her boys, and begged for their safe return. But as investigators probed deeper, cracks began to appear. Her story was vague and oddly rehearsed. She failed multiple polygraph tests. Her demeanor shifted when the cameras were off, less fragile, more calculated. The timeline didn't add up. There was no evidence of forced entry into her car. No witnesses had seen the alleged carjacking. Detectives, seasoned in reading subtle cues of deception, grew suspicious. Then came the journal entries. During a search of her belongings, authorities uncovered notes Susan had written in the weeks before the disappearance, which revealed a devastating motive. She had recently ended a passionate relationship with a wealthy local man named Tom Findley. He was young, successful, the son of her boss, and had made it clear in a letter that he did not want children. That rejection, specifically, his line that her boys were a burden, stung Susan to the core. Desperate to win him back and convinced her children were the obstacle to love, she made a decision that would haunt history. On the night of October 25, after tucking her sons into their car seats in her Mazda Protégé, Susan drove them to John D. Long Lake, a remote body of water with no one around, no lights, no interference. The boys, dressed in pajamas, were likely drowsy, perhaps giggling or asking questions from the back seat as toddlers do. Susan stopped the car near the edge of the boat ramp, shifted into neutral, and stepped out. With one hand on the steering wheel, she released the brake. The car crept forward, tires crunching gravel, dipping nose first into the lake. The boys screamed. She stood and watched, frozen by the horror she had unleashed, or perhaps numbed by a fantasy in which their deaths would finally bring her freedom. The car sank slowly into the dark, still water, the boys trapped inside, their cries muffled until the lake swallowed them whole. She waited a moment, then walked to a nearby house and claimed she had been hijacked. From that moment on, the lie began. In interviews, she portrayed herself as shattered, holding back sobs with theatrical grace. America believed her. The media made her a grieving mother icon, an image burned into collective consciousness. But it all came crashing down on November 3, 1994, when Susan confessed. The pressure from police, the growing inconsistencies, and the burden of guilt finally cracked her mask. She told authorities where to find the car, and divers were sent to John D. Long Lake. What they found would haunt even the most seasoned professionals: the upside-down vehicle, the tiny bodies of Michael and Alex still strapped in their seats, waterlogged toys floating beside them, their faces pressed against glass that no one would ever see them through again. The nation, once sympathetic, turned enraged. The lie had not only stolen the lives of 2 innocent children, it had manipulated an entire country, weaponized race, and betrayed the most sacred trust society places in mothers. Susan Smith became a symbol not of loss, but of cold-blooded deception. During the interrogation, she admitted her motive without much emotion. "I wanted to be free," she said. "I just wanted it to be over." Her voice, eerily calm, betrayed the horror of what she had done. In court, the prosecution sought the death penalty, arguing that her actions were not only premeditated but executed with chilling deliberation. They described how she could have saved her sons, how she could have called for help at any point, how the entire community had been emotionally extorted by her lie. But the defense argued that Susan was a deeply troubled woman, battling depression, childhood trauma, and a history of sexual abuse. Her father had died by suicide when she was a child. Her stepfather had molested her for years, something she had revealed in letters prior to the murders. Psychiatrists testified that she suffered from dependent personality disorder and a severe identity crisis, exacerbated by rejection and the pressure to maintain a facade of control. It became a trial not just about justice, but about the limits of empathy. Was Susan a calculating killer, or a woman unraveling under the weight of a life she couldn't bear? The jury ultimately chose life imprisonment over death, sentencing her to life with the possibility of parole after 30 years. She would not be eligible until 2024, a date that loomed as the world speculated on whether she still posed a threat, or whether she even felt remorse. In prison, Susan Smith faded from headlines but remained a dark legend in the American true crime archive. She reportedly maintained a manipulative streak, forming inappropriate relationships with guards, and rarely speaking about the boys she drowned. Those who met her described her as emotionally shallow, always redirecting conversations away from the past, as though her infamy were a misunderstanding rather than a consequence. Yet, every so often, news outlets would resurface her name, reminding the public of the smiling woman who sobbed on television while her children's bodies were sinking beneath the still surface of a lake. What makes Susan Smith's case so haunting is not just the act, but the performance. Her calculated use of race, her ability to feign grief, and her total erasure of maternal instinct created a rupture in public trust. She didn't just betray her children, she betrayed the image of what a mother should be. And perhaps that's what hurts most, the idea that a child can look into his mother's eyes in his final moments and see not rescue, but abandonment. The car still sits in evidence photographs, murky and rusted, like a sunken coffin carrying the truth Susan tried to drown. But the truth floated back. And it's still there, lingering in the water, echoing in the courtroom, etched in every tear-soaked news clip where America cried not just for 2 boys lost, but for the cruel, unfathomable choice their mother made. The aftermath of Susan Smith's confession didn't just leave a grieving community in shock, it unraveled a tangled knot of issues that ran far deeper than a single act of filicide. The murder of her sons, Michael and Alex, was heinous enough. But it was the calculated deception, the use of a fictitious black carjacker, that sparked outrage across racial, political, and psychological spectrums. Her lie wasn't random, it was strategic. She tapped into a long-standing cultural stereotype, evoking the image of a dangerous black man attacking a helpless white mother. In doing so, she redirected national sympathy, obscured truth, and reinforced racist tropes that have historically fueled wrongful accusations, lynchings, and unjust incarceration. For 9 days, her story gave permission to every latent fear buried in the American consciousness. Black men across Union, South Carolina, were stopped, questioned, and viewed with suspicion. One man, who fit the vague description she offered, a young black male in a knit cap, was harassed and temporarily detained, his face flashed across news outlets. The national media, hungry for an emotional narrative, played along without question. And all the while, Susan stood in front of the cameras, tears rolling down her cheeks, clutching the teddy bears and blankets her sons once held. This performance, more than anything, revealed the horrifying power of perception, how easily grief can be faked, how easily bias can be manipulated, and how devastating the consequences of a lie can become when it feeds into existing societal wounds. When the truth emerged, it wasn't just the murders that shattered the public, it was the betrayal. Susan hadn't just taken her children's lives, she had stained the already fraught conversation around race and justice in America. In the courtroom, prosecutors presented a clear and deliberate timeline of events. Susan had driven to the lake, waited until the roads were empty, and slowly allowed her car to sink with her boys inside. They offered forensic evidence that proved there had been no struggle, no outside attacker, no signs of forced entry or a hijacking. It was cold, methodical, and unthinkable. The defense countered with a narrative of mental illness, trauma, and a desperate woman pushed to the brink. They brought in psychologists who testified that Susan suffered from major depressive disorder, dependent personality disorder, and unresolved sexual trauma stemming from years of abuse by her stepfather, a man who had later admitted to engaging in an inappropriate relationship with her. They painted a portrait of a woman emotionally frozen at the age of her first betrayal, someone who sought affection in all the wrong places and was addicted to the fantasy of being rescued by a man who could fix everything. That fantasy had a name, Tom Findlay. The wealthy son of Susan's employer, Tom had dated her briefly but ended the relationship, stating in a letter that he did not want to be involved with someone who had children. To Susan, that rejection was a death sentence to her identity. Her children, who should have been the light of her life, became the obstacles in her twisted path to love. Her decision to kill them wasn't born from a psychotic break, the prosecution argued, but from narcissistic entitlement. She believed she deserved happiness at any cost, even if that cost was the lives of her sons. During the trial, Susan's demeanor was scrutinized just as intensely as the evidence itself. She wept at times, but her tears often seemed mistimed or manipulative. She appeared concerned with her appearance, at times asking for special privileges in jail regarding makeup and clothing. One reporter noted how she smiled at the jury when she entered the courtroom, almost as if she forgot why she was there. This disconnect between her behavior and the gravity of her crimes became a focal point in the public psyche. How could someone cry for help one moment and then laugh with her attorney the next? Was it guilt, or was it guiltlessness, a complete detachment from conscience? The trial lasted 3 weeks, but the deliberation took just over 2 hours. The jury found her guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. And though prosecutors had sought the death penalty, the jury opted for life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Some argued that her gender and tearful persona spared her the needle, while others believed that executing her would have made martyrs of the children rather than focusing on prevention and accountability. But regardless of the sentence, the emotional toll of the trial lingered. The town of Union had rallied around a mother they thought was in pain, only to discover that they had been emotionally exploited. The search parties, the vigils, the prayers, it had all been a performance directed by the very person they had trusted most. And as the years passed, Susan's infamy only deepened. She became the subject of documentaries, true crime specials, podcasts, and books. Her image, young, pretty, tear-streaked, was forever frozen in time as a symbol of motherhood gone wrong. But even more damning was her silence. From prison, she rarely spoke publicly about the boys. She gave the occasional interview, always framed by denials and self-victimization. In one statement, she said, "I am not the monster society thinks I am." but the world wasn't convinced. In prison, she was disciplined multiple times for inappropriate relationships with guards and manipulative behavior. Fellow inmates described her as cold, calculating, and consumed by her own narrative. In 2010, she was briefly hospitalized after attempting self-harm, and some believed it was a ploy for attention or parole sympathy. That parole hearing, long dreaded by the public, finally arrived in 2024. But even then, she showed no measurable remorse, offering vague statements of sorrow that lacked specificity or emotional depth. The board denied her parole unanimously, citing her continued lack of accountability and insight into her crimes. She remains incarcerated in South Carolina, eligible to reapply every 2 years, but public sentiment shows no signs of shifting in her favor. The legacy of Susan Smith is more than just a tragedy, it's a mirror. It reflects how society views women, motherhood, race, mental health, and justice. It reminds us that killers don't always come in the form of monsters or maniacs. Sometimes, they come in the form of a soft voice, a delicate frame, a mother who cries on cue and hides her true face behind mascara and grief. Susan's story isn't just about drowning 2 children, it's about drowning truth, trust, and the myth that a mother's love is always sacred. In that cold lake in South Carolina, she didn't just sink a car. She sank the very image of maternal purity that many Americans hold dear. And from the surface of that water, we are left to stare into our own reflection and ask, how did we believe her? How did we let the tears blind us to the truth? And how many more children have we failed to save because their mother looked like she was hurting, when in fact, she was the danger all along? To the outside world, the no-tech house in rural Raymond, Washington, looked like any other home, aged siding, a long gravel driveway, the scattered noise of kids and dogs, but behind its doors lay a horror show so surreal, so unrelentingly cruel, that even seasoned detectives struggled to comprehend it. At the center of it all stood Michelle Shelley Notek, a woman who called herself a loving mother but in truth wielded motherhood as a weapon, one laced with psychological torment, physical abuse, and emotional destruction. Unlike the other cases in this book, Shelley didn't snap in a single tragic moment or descend into madness under the weight of depression. Her evil was steady, strategic, and terrifyingly consistent over time. Her cruelty wasn't a collapse, it was a lifestyle. Her 3 daughters, Nikki, Sammy, and Tori, grew up in a home where hugs and horror came hand in hand, where praise was laced with manipulation, and where loyalty was demanded under threat of pain. Shelley, charismatic and unpredictable, created a world where her love was a currency, and obedience was bought with fear. She convinced her daughters that everything she did, no matter how twisted, was for their own good. She beat them, starved them, isolated them, and punished them for imaginary infractions. And yet she told them she was the best mother in the world. The girls wore second-hand clothes while Shelley lavished herself with makeup, manicures, and shopping sprees. But what made her reign of terror uniquely monstrous was how she extended her abuse far beyond her own children. Over the years, she brought vulnerable people into her home, friends, distant relatives, runaways, offering them shelter, only to strip away their dignity, isolate them from the outside world, and slowly destroy them, piece by piece. One of her victims was Kathy Lorino, a trusting hairdresser and Shelley's longtime friend. After a rough patch in her life, Kathy moved in with the Noteks in the early 1990s. What began as a refuge quickly turned into a prison. Shelley forced Kathy to do endless chores, forbade her from bathing, beat her regularly, made her sleep on the floor, and subjected her to extreme humiliation, locking her naked in a basement, forcing her to eat her own vomit, and making her believe she was insane. And through it all, Shelley gaslighted her, saying it was all to make her better. Eventually, Kathy stopped resisting. Her hair fell out. Her teeth rotted. Her body weakened. She became a shadow. And then one day, after years of suffering, she simply died. But Shelley didn't panic. Instead, she wrapped Kathy's corpse in plastic, stored it, and calmly told her daughters that Kathy had gone to live with someone else. The girls, already deeply conditioned by their mother's twisted logic, accepted it, because to question Shelley was to risk becoming the next target. Another victim was Shane Watson, Shelley's teenage nephew, who came to live with them after bouncing through unstable foster care. Shane was sweet, quiet, and eager to belong. Shelley welcomed him warmly, then subjected him to the same cycle of torture she'd perfected. She made him strip naked for punishments, beat him with belts, and locked him in sheds overnight. When he began keeping a journal to record what he saw, including the truth about Kathy's death, Shelley's manipulation turned deadly. She convinced her husband, Dave Notek, to kill him. Dave, a man so dominated by Shelley that he could no longer distinguish her commands from morality, shot Shane in the back of the head and buried him on the property. Shelley again spun a story. Shane had run away. No one questioned her. Then came Ron Woodworth, another vulnerable adult who was seeking comfort and connection. Instead, he was stripped of his identity and health by Shelley's systematic abuse. She made him do yard work naked, forced him to drink bleach, beat him daily, and eventually reduced him to a hunched, bleeding, broken figure who could barely speak. When Ron died, emaciated and bruised, Shelley burned his body in the backyard and told everyone he'd moved to California. And still, no one came. No alarms were raised. No neighbors spoke up. The house sat in silence while Shelley laughed, gardened, and told her daughters how lucky they were to have her. It wasn't until her youngest daughter, Tori, began to see through the lies that the cycle started to crack. Tori confided in a friend, who convinced her to speak to police. When law enforcement finally descended upon the Notek home, what they uncovered was not just a series of murders, but a psychological dungeon where fear ruled and love was weaponized. They found no graves, only ash, fragments of bone, and a trail of terror buried in the minds of 3 girls who had survived the unimaginable. Shelley Notek was arrested in 2003, charged with multiple counts of murder, abuse, and criminal mistreatment. Her husband, Dave, confessed to the killings under pressure, his voice hollow, broken by years of complicity. The daughters testified, each unraveling the horror of their childhood, each peeling back the layers of manipulation that had kept them silent for so long. In court, Shelley remained eerily composed, still insisting she was a good mother, still clinging to the delusion that everything she did was done out of love. Her sentence, 22 years in prison, was seen by many as shockingly light, a slap on the wrist for a woman whose actions had ended multiple lives and emotionally crippled her children. But the psychological damage she inflicted stretched far beyond her sentence. Nikki, Sammy, and Tori spent years in therapy, trying to reclaim the meaning of trust, of family, of love. They wrote books, spoke publicly, and struggled to rebuild their sense of self after a lifetime of gaslighting and pain. What makes Shelley Notek's story particularly horrifying is its slow burn, the years of abuse, the gradual descent, the way it all happened behind closed doors while the world outside looked away. Unlike the brief, explosive tragedies of Andrea Yates or Susan Smith, Shelley's evil was enduring. It was quiet. It wore the mask of motherhood and whispered lies into the ears of children who only wanted to be loved. In the end, her story is not just one of murder, but of control, how a mother turned every bond into a noose, every act of care into a cage. She didn't just kill bodies. She killed spirits. And even now, as she walks free after serving her sentence, her daughters carry the weight of what she did every single day. A mother is supposed to nurture. Shelley Notek broke that promise again and again, until her home became not a place of safety, but a nightmare no one could wake from. When the truth about Michelle Shelley Notek came crashing down in 2003, it wasn't just the community of Raymond, Washington, that reeled in disbelief, it was the entire nation, struggling to comprehend how a mother could become a master of torture within the very walls that should have been filled with bedtime stories, peanut butter sandwiches, and unconditional love. The horror that played out over years in the Notek household was more than a series of murders, it was a sustained psychological war on humanity, waged by a woman who wrapped her sadism in the language of love, control, and maternal sacrifice. The survivors, her 3 daughters, Nikki, Sammy, and Tori, emerged from that house like hostages blinking into the sunlight, trying to make sense of a childhood where affection came wrapped in cruelty, and obedience was purchased through humiliation. Shelley didn't beat her children into silence the way some abusive parents do. She groomed them, manipulated them into believing that loyalty to her was virtue, that the pain they endured was their own fault, and that those who suffered even more, like Kathy, Shane, and Ron, deserved it. She played a game of psychological chess with young minds, blurring the lines between care and punishment, until her daughters believed that protecting her was the only way to protect themselves. For years, Nikki and Sammy endured being stripped naked, thrown into mud pits, locked in closets, and denied basic hygiene, all while being told it was for their own good. She made them write false confessions, blame each other for things they hadn't done, and convinced them that the outside world would never believe them if they spoke out. And they didn't speak, because in the world Shelley created, she was God, and God did not tolerate betrayal. But the cracks eventually appeared. It was the youngest daughter, Tori, born after Shelley's reign of terror had already claimed its earlier victims, who first began to see the nightmare for what it was. Tori was different. She asked questions. She didn't accept the distortions as easily. Perhaps because she had seen just enough to be horrified, but not enough to be paralyzed by the same deep-seated conditioning her sisters carried. Tori's growing courage became the turning point, not just for her, but for all of them. She secretly began confiding in friends at school, describing scenes so unimaginable they sounded like horror fiction. A naked man crawling through glass in the yard. A friend of the family suddenly vanishing without a trace. Punishments that were more like rituals of humiliation. Eventually, one friend told a parent, who contacted the authorities, and just like that, the fortress of fear Shelley had built over decades began to fall. When detectives arrived at the Notek residence, they were met with a disturbing quietness, an eerie absence of chaos, as though the house itself had been trained to lie. But the daughters, once cornered by compassion and professionalism instead of fear and coercion, broke open. They told everything. The punishments, the victims, the lies. Investigators began unearthing the truth, first with testimony, then with confessions, then with the sickening discovery of ash piles in the backyard, where Ron Woodworth's remains had been incinerated. Dave Notek, Shelley's soft-spoken husband, folded under questioning. He admitted to killing Shane Watson and burning Ron's body. He told investigators how Shelley had convinced him that Shane was dangerous, that the boy had to be dealt with before he went to the police. In truth, Shane was a frightened teenager who had seen too much. He had kept a journal, documenting the torture of Kathy Lorino and fearing for his own life. When Dave shot him in the head, he didn't do it out of malice, he did it because Shelley told him to. And he obeyed, like he always did. Like everyone in that house had been conditioned to. When the charges were filed, Shelley Notek was arrested for second-degree murder and manslaughter. Dave was charged with murder and criminal disposal of human remains. But what followed in the courtroom baffled the public, because despite the horror she had orchestrated, Shelley struck a plea deal that would allow her to serve only 22 years. Many were enraged. How could a woman whose manipulations had led to the deaths of at least 3 people, and the psychological ruin of her own children, receive such a light sentence? But prosecutors feared that her daughters, still emotionally fragile, might not survive the trauma of a full trial. And with Dave's cooperation, they had enough to ensure she wouldn't walk free without consequence. Still, justice felt diluted. She was sent to the Washington Corrections Center for Women, where she served her time in relative anonymity. She played the model inmate, helping others, keeping to herself, never admitting guilt. Psychologists who studied the case believe Shelley fits the profile of a malignant narcissist with sadistic tendencies, a rare but dangerous personality type that derives pleasure from dominance and emotional destruction. What separates her from more impulsive killers is her patience. She didn't kill in rage. She didn't snap. She constructed her crimes like an artist, layer by layer, with a cold and calculated brush. What's even more chilling is that she made her victims complicit in their own destruction. Kathy Lorino, once a vibrant hairdresser full of life, was broken down piece by piece until she stopped resisting. Ron Woodworth was tortured so severely that his skin peeled from his feet and his teeth fell out, yet he still referred to Shelley as Mom. That's the power she held. She didn't just kill bodies. She dismantled spirits. And the fallout of her reign continues today. Nikki Notek, the oldest daughter, struggled for years with substance abuse and post-traumatic stress. Sammy wrestled with anxiety and guilt. Tori, though the catalyst for Shelley's capture, has said that she sometimes still wakes up in a panic, hearing her mother's voice in her dreams. The trauma is generational and chronic, etched into the neural wiring of 3 women who learned early on that love could mean cruelty, and silence could mean survival. In 2022, news broke that Shelley Notek would be released in the summer of 2022 after serving her full sentence. The backlash was immediate. Journalists revisited the case. Podcasts surged in downloads. Readers devoured Greg Olson and Rebecca Morris's book If You Tell, which documented the full, grisly story in harrowing detail. People asked the same question over and over: how could someone so dangerous be allowed to walk free? Shelley now lives in Washington state, reportedly under supervision but not in custody. Her daughters, all now adults, have made it clear they want nothing to do with her. And yet, the shadow of their mother follows them wherever they go. They bear not only the scars of their own abuse but the weight of public fascination. People want to know how they survived, how they healed, how they look so normal now. But inside, they carry a secret most of us will never understand, that even monsters can tuck you in at night, say they love you, and make you believe the bruises are your fault. Shelley Notek's story forces us to rethink what evil looks like. It doesn't always come with knives or guns. Sometimes, it comes with breakfast in the morning and a kiss goodnight. Sometimes it wears the face of a mother. And in that chilling truth, we find the darkest corner of all, where the people meant to protect us become the ones we must escape to survive. Clara Harris wasn't the woman you'd expect to see on trial for murder. She was poised, successful, impeccably dressed, and by all appearances, the epitome of the American dream, a Colombian immigrant who had carved out a respected life in Houston as a prominent dentist, loving mother, and devoted wife. But beneath the polished exterior was a woman whose world would collapse in the most public and brutal way possible. Clara had built her life around family, her twin sons from a previous marriage, and her second husband, David Harris, a charismatic orthodontist with whom she shared both a dental practice and a carefully manicured life of luxury. They drove nice cars, took vacations, and lived in a spacious home in Friendswood, Texas. But in the summer of 2002, Clara's perfectly constructed life began to show cracks when she discovered that David was having an affair with his receptionist, the younger and blonde Lindsay Lipsey. At first, Clara was devastated. She wept, begged, and pleaded for David to stay. But when that didn't work, her devastation twisted slowly, dangerously, into something else. The betrayal ignited a fire in her that decades of calm professionalism had kept buried, one fed by humiliation, fury, and a deeply wounded pride. She began stalking her husband, hiring private investigators to follow him, checking phone records, and confronting Lindsay with venomous phone calls. But it all came to a head on July 24, 2002, when the investigators she had hired confirmed what she feared most: David and Lindsay were at the Nassau Bay Hilton, the very hotel where she and David had married. With her stepdaughter Lindsay, David's teenage daughter from a previous marriage, in the car beside her, Clara drove to the hotel, trembling with purpose. What happened next would be replayed in courtrooms and living rooms across the country. In the parking lot of that Hilton, Clara Harris didn't just confront her cheating husband, she ran him over with her silver Mercedes-Benz. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. The security cameras captured everything: the grainy, black and white footage of the luxury car circling, the body slamming against the pavement, the screams. The footage would become infamous, a shocking visual of a woman unhinged by rage. Clara claimed it was an accident, that she had only intended to confront David, that she had lost control. But the facts told a different story. Witnesses said Clara screamed, "You can't have him," before slamming the gas pedal. Her own stepdaughter, who was in the passenger seat, told police that Clara circled back deliberately, again and again, as David's broken body lay on the pavement. His skull was crushed, his ribs shattered. Death was instant. But what truly stunned the public wasn't just the brutality, it was who committed it. Clara wasn't a woman from a violent background. She wasn't known for outbursts or mental illness. She was a dentist, a mother, a figure of composure. And that's what made the case explode. Because if Clara Harris, educated, successful, polished, could become a killer, what did that say about the rest of us? About how close even the most controlled people might be to losing everything in a moment of emotional chaos? At her trial, Clara wept. Her defense attorneys painted her as a scorned woman overwhelmed by heartbreak, caught in a temporary storm of passion. They argued that it wasn't premeditated, that Clara had only meant to confront her husband and had lost control in the heat of betrayal. They emphasized her lack of criminal history, her contributions to the community, her love for her children. But the prosecution pushed back hard. They painted Clara as calculating, someone who had spent days plotting revenge. They showed how she tracked David's movements, hired investigators, and drove to the hotel with knowledge of what she would find. They described how she had not only run him over but circled back to finish the job. Her stepdaughter's testimony was damning. The girl described her father's body thudding beneath the car, the look of cold determination on Clara's face, the screams that followed. When the jury watched the surveillance video, there was an audible gasp. It was clear. It was visual. It was undeniable. And it became the centerpiece of the trial, a modern trial by media where America collectively watched a woman destroy her husband with the very car that symbolized their wealth and status. Clara was convicted of murder but spared a life sentence. She received 20 years in prison with the possibility of parole. The verdict sparked heated debate across the country. Some saw her as a woman pushed past her breaking point, a tragic figure betrayed and undone by infidelity. Others saw a cold-blooded killer who had methodically eliminated her husband in a fit of prideful vengeance. But what no one could deny was the emotional storm behind her actions, the way love and betrayal can twist into something so consuming that murder seems like a form of justice. In interviews from prison, Clara maintained that she never meant to kill David. That it was an accident. That she had blacked out in the moment. Her voice was calm, almost chillingly composed. She spoke more about the betrayal than the murder, more about how he hurt her than about how she ended his life. And perhaps that says more than any courtroom transcript could. Because for Clara, David didn't just break their marriage, he shattered her identity. And in that final act, in that hotel parking lot, she tried to reclaim something she had lost. Control. Power. Pride. When Clara was released on parole in 2018 after serving 15 years, she returned to a world that still remembered her name. She lives quietly now, far from the cameras, far from the Mercedes-Benz that made her infamous. But her story still echoes, on talk shows, in documentaries, in law textbooks. Because Clara Harris wasn't a psychopath. She wasn't evil. She was human. And her case became a terrifying reminder of what humans are capable of when love curdles into hate, when betrayal festers like an infection, and when the person who once held your heart in their hands breaks it so badly that all you can do is watch everything, marriage, family, sanity, crash beneath the wheels. In the aftermath of David Harris's brutal death beneath the wheels of his wife's Mercedes-Benz, America was left not only stunned by the raw footage of his final moments but also deeply unsettled by the realization that the woman behind the wheel, a polished, respected, middle-class mother, could so easily become a murderer. Clara Harris didn't fit the mold. She wasn't unhinged. She wasn't a ticking time bomb. She was gentle in tone, professionally successful, and by all external measures, emotionally balanced. But the reality of her crime cut through that facade like a scalpel. Her rage, buried under decades of dignity, respectability, and the quiet sacrifices expected of wives and mothers, had been growing in silence, fed by betrayal, fueled by humiliation, and finally detonated in a hotel parking lot as she watched her husband kiss another woman. Clara wasn't just enraged by the affair, she was enraged by the erasure of her identity, by the years of devotion that now seemed irrelevant, and by the cold slap of watching her husband, who had once vowed fidelity, treat a younger woman with the intimacy he had withdrawn from their marriage. It wasn't just infidelity. It was invisibility. And that invisible grief festered into the kind of fury that makes headlines and cautionary tales. What shocked jurors and psychiatrists alike was how calculated her movements were during those final moments. She had her stepdaughter in the car. She knew where David was. She didn't run him down in a moment of chaotic madness. She circled him again and again, like a predator choosing when to pounce. That surveillance footage didn't just capture a killing. It captured intent. The woman who had once made people's teeth shine was now grinding her husband into the pavement beneath a car designed for elegance, status, and power. Clara had always chased perfection, the perfect marriage, the perfect career, the perfect family portrait. But what she couldn't chase was time, or David's roving eyes, or the cultural message that women over 40 should feel disposable. She was 44. Lindsay Lipsey, David's mistress, was in her 20s. For Clara, that age gap wasn't just numeric, it was existential. It screamed everything she feared, that her youth was gone, that her beauty had faded, that she could no longer compete in a world obsessed with reinvention and novelty. In killing David, Clara wasn't just punishing betrayal. She was trying to destroy the symbol of everything she had been replaced by. And the fact that her stepdaughter witnessed the entire act added a layer of tragedy so brutal it almost defies comprehension. Lindsay, David's teen daughter, had been caught in the crossfire of two adult egos collapsing. She watched her father's head crush against concrete. She heard his screams. She saw Clara's face, emotionless, cold, resolved, as she circled the lot to ensure the job was done. That trauma would become a permanent scar, replaying itself in courtroom testimonies, therapy sessions, and the silence of every holiday dinner that followed. In many ways, Clara's story became less about murder and more about the unspoken tension between love and ownership. Because for all her tears in court, for all her claims of regret, Clara never truly divorced her emotions from her actions. She mourned David in the way a child mourns a broken toy, something she once cherished, then watched slip through her fingers, only to shatter it in a fit of frustration. Her prison sentence, 20 years with parole eligibility after 15, was seen by some as lenient, by others as fair. During those years behind bars, Clara maintained her innocence in tone if not in word. She admitted to causing his death, yes, but insisted she had blacked out in a haze of emotion, that it hadn't been her intention. Yet the investigators, jurors, and even some of her supporters struggled with that version. The video didn't lie. The tire marks told a story. The deliberate steering, the second and third pass over his body, the eyewitness accounts, it all pointed to a mind not lost, but calculated. Even so, Clara became a kind of strange martyr in certain corners of public opinion. Talk show hosts speculated on whether her punishment was fueled more by gendered expectations than the crime itself. Would a man, they asked, have received the same punishment for killing a cheating wife? Or would he have been called temporarily insane, a victim of passion, a man pushed past the brink? The question lingered in the public consciousness, dividing opinion between those who saw Clara as a woman undone by pain and those who saw her as a murderer who used emotion as a shield. What complicated the narrative even more was Clara's behavior after prison. Released in 2018, she didn't write a book. She didn't go on a redemption tour. She faded into relative obscurity, living quietly in Texas and avoiding the spotlight altogether. Those who knew her said she was still the same, reserved, polite, and somehow untouched by the magnitude of what she had done. And perhaps that's the most disturbing part of Clara's story, that beneath the surface, she was always calm. Always composed. Always convincing. The kind of woman who could smile at you during a dental checkup, then go home and track her husband's every move with the precision of a forensic expert. Clara's rage wasn't loud. It was internalized. Compressed into years of trying to be enough. Enough for David. Enough for their kids. Enough for a society that tells women their worth has an expiration date. So when the betrayal came, when she discovered the wedding hotel was now a stage for her husband's infidelity, she didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She simply opened the door to her Mercedes, slid inside, and rewrote her love story with rubber and blood. And in doing so, she joined a haunting club, women who turned love into violence, pain into justice, and heartbreak into murder. Clara's case remains one of the most chilling reminders of how thin the line can be between control and chaos. Because sometimes, the real danger isn't a stranger with a weapon. Sometimes it's the person sitting across from you at dinner, holding a glass of wine in one hand and a storm behind their eyes. A storm you won't see until it's too late. On the surface, Diane Downs seemed like any other young mother in small-town Oregon during the early 1980s, friendly, bubbly, and often seen with her 3 bright-eyed children in tow. But behind the perky smile and feathered blonde hair was a storm of narcissism, delusion, and a desperate hunger for love that would ultimately drive her to commit one of the most shocking and senseless crimes in American history. On the night of May 19, 1983, Diane pulled up to the emergency entrance of Mackenzie Willamette Hospital in Springfield, Oregon, her car soaked in blood and her children clinging to life in the back seat. Cheryl, age 7, was already dead. Danny, age 3, was paralyzed from the waist down. Christy, age 8, was clinging to life with a bullet lodged in her brain. Diane herself had a gunshot wound in her arm, superficial, neat, and suspiciously clean. Through tears, she told doctors and police that she and her children had been ambushed by a shaggy-haired stranger on a back road who had flagged them down, demanded her keys, and opened fire when she refused. Her story was dramatic, cinematic even. But something didn't sit right from the start. While her children were being rushed into surgery, Diane sat calmly in the waiting room, chatting with hospital staff, laughing inappropriately, and showing off her bandaged arm like a war wound. Police immediately found holes in her tail, no sign of a struggle, no evidence of another person at the scene, and no fingerprints but her own. But it wasn't just the inconsistencies that raised alarms, it was Diane's demeanor. She was strangely detached, more concerned with how her hair looked in the mirror than with the fact that her daughter was dead and her other two were fighting for their lives. And when police began to dig into her past, what they found was chilling: a woman who had always viewed motherhood not as a responsibility, but as a means to an end, a stage upon which to perform, manipulate, and ultimately discard anything or anyone who interfered with her desires. Diane had grown up feeling unloved and unnoticed. Her strict, emotionally distant upbringing in Arizona had left her starved for attention. As a teenager, she rebelled against her conservative parents and chased affection in the form of men, any man who would pay attention to her. She married young, had children quickly, and found herself overwhelmed by the realities of motherhood. Her marriage collapsed. Her responsibilities bored her. But what Diane craved above all else was validation. She wanted to be adored, pursued, wanted. When she met a married man named Robert Knickerbocker, Nick to her, she became obsessed. Nick didn't want children. He made that clear. He told Diane he didn't want to raise anyone else's kids, didn't want the drama. But Diane saw that not as a deal-breaker, but as a challenge. In her twisted mind, her children were now obstacles. They were barriers between her and the man she wanted. And when Nick ended the relationship, Diane didn't grieve like a heartbroken woman. She plotted like a spurned child. The plan she devised was chilling in its cruelty: eliminate the problem, frame a phantom assailant, and step into the role of grieving mother with all the tears, press conferences, and spotlight she secretly craved. But even her performance was flawed. Police noted how her emotions didn't match her words. In interviews, she spoke of the attack with theatrical flair, often smiling when she spoke about her children, even cracking jokes about how messy the car had been after the shooting. It was as though she were playing a role in her own made-for-TV movie, oblivious to the horror of the real script. The breakthrough came when Christy, the oldest child, regained her ability to speak after months of recovery. Through intense therapy and coaxing, Christy finally whispered the truth: "Mom did it." That chilling sentence shattered any remaining doubt. Diane Downs had not been the victim of a roadside ambush. She had been the executioner. She had driven her children to a secluded location, pulled out a .22 caliber handgun, and one by one, shot them in cold blood. Her own wound had been self-inflicted, a calculated part of her alibi. Arrested in February 1984, Diane showed no remorse. In court, she smirked, posed for cameras, and even flirted with male jurors. She wore bright colors and curled her hair for each appearance, presenting herself as the misunderstood woman, a mother wronged by fate, misunderstood by a system eager to vilify her. But the evidence spoke volumes. The ballistics matched the gun she'd once owned. Her diary revealed her obsession with Nick. Her stories kept changing. And then came the most unthinkable revelation of all: During the investigation and trial, Diane had become pregnant again, by another casual lover, believing, perhaps, that a new baby would sway public opinion in her favor, paint her as the ever-loving mother, forever nurturing, forever victimized. It backfired. The jury convicted her of murder, attempted murder, and assault. She was sentenced to life in prison plus 50 years. Her newborn daughter, later named Rebecca, was adopted by another family and raised far from the darkness of her biological mother's legacy. Christy and Danny were adopted by the lead prosecutor in the case, a man so shaken by the horror that he vowed to give the surviving children a safe home. In prison, Diane continued her manipulative games. She gave interviews, changed her story repeatedly, and maintained her innocence despite overwhelming evidence. She claimed she was framed, that the real killer was still out there, that the system had targeted her because she didn't cry on cue. Over the decades, she has applied for parole multiple times, each time denied, each time showing no genuine remorse, each time judged as manipulative, dangerous, and narcissistic. What makes Diane Downs stand out in the gallery of murderous mothers isn't just the brutality of her act, it's the cold, performative way she tried to play both victim and hero, using her children's suffering as a prop in her own twisted narrative. Her crime forced the nation to grapple with a truth it didn't want to face, that not every mother loves unconditionally, that some see their children not as sacred beings to protect, but as obstacles to destroy. Diane's smile, the one that danced across cameras as her children lay in hospital beds, became a haunting emblem of deception. Behind it wasn't sorrow. It was calculation, control, self-obsession so deep it obliterated even the most basic maternal instinct. Her story remains one of the most disturbing testaments to how delusion, rejection, and narcissism can converge in a single devastating moment and destroy everything in their path. Even after being convicted of one of the most heartless crimes in American history, Diane Downs continued to insist on her innocence with the stubbornness of someone trapped in her own fantasy, a woman who refused to admit, even to herself, that she had pulled the trigger not once, but 3 times, aiming cold steel at her own flesh and blood. It was the lies she wrapped herself in like armor. And the most terrifying part? She wore that lie with grace. In every prison interview she gave following her conviction, Diane was composed, articulate, and disturbingly calm, as if she were recounting a bad dream rather than the night she destroyed her children's lives. She spoke about her case with detachment, peppering her speech with just enough emotion to seem believable but never enough to ring true. When asked about Christy, Danny, and Cheryl, her words were hollow, free of the depth, rage, or remorse that even a guilty person might express under the weight of memory. Instead, Diane spun a different narrative, that she was the victim of a witch hunt, that the justice system had failed her, and that the man who shot her children was still out there. She even claimed, at times, that she knew who he was, but refused to name him. They never wanted the truth, she told a reporter. They wanted someone to blame. But no one bought it, not the investigators who had pieced together the blood-stained puzzle, not the prosecutors who had watched her smirk through trial, and certainly not the 2 children who survived her betrayal and grew up with the echo of gunfire etched into their memories. What Diane didn't understand, or refused to confront, was that her every movement post-trial only confirmed what everyone already suspected: she was a pathological narcissist. She didn't just commit murder, she rewrote reality to suit her. Even in prison, her manipulation continued. She wrote long letters to strangers, trying to build support. She shifted details of the crime in every retelling. Sometimes, she said, the man at the roadside was wearing a ski mask. Other times, he had a beard. Sometimes she was brave. Sometimes she was helpless. But the one detail that never changed in her narrative? She was always the center. The victim. The misunderstood heroine in a tale that never quite added up. Psychologists who studied her behavior described her as a classic case of malignant narcissism, a cocktail of grandiosity, manipulation, lack of empathy, and pathological lying. To Diane, the truth was fluid, something to mold and shape depending on who was watching. And that's what made her so dangerous, not just what she did, but the way she did it, and how she continued to try to charm her way into redemption. In 1993, during one of her parole hearings, Diane again denied everything. "I didn't shoot my kids," she said, her voice steady. "I love my kids." But the board wasn't moved. One commissioner asked her why, then, did Christie testify against her? Diane paused, then gave a chilling answer: she was just confused. She's been brainwashed. It was another cruel twist of her narrative, casting the daughter she shot in the chest as the one who had been manipulated, not by Diane, but by those who saved her. Her parole was denied, again. And again. Every time she appeared before the board, she offered the same performance. No confession. No remorse. Just denial wrapped in delusion. But outside the prison walls, the real story of Diane Downs was taking root, in books, documentaries, and in the lives of the children who survived her. Christie and Danny were adopted by Fred Hugie, the lead prosecutor, and his wife, a symbolic reclaiming of innocence from the clutches of evil. Under their care, Christie slowly rebuilt her shattered voice. Danny, paralyzed for life, grew into a man marked but not broken. They lived with the constant ache of their sister's absence, the trauma of being betrayed by the one person who was supposed to protect them. But they also lived something Cheryl never had the chance to do. Cheryl, the middle child, who had once written in her diary, "My mom gets mad at us a lot," was the first to die. Her brief life, filled with warning signs missed and ignored, became a rallying cry for better child protective services and deeper psychological evaluations in custody cases. And then there was Becky Babcock, the daughter Diane gave birth to while awaiting trial. Becky grew up not knowing who her biological mother was until adolescence, when curiosity led her down a path of devastating discovery. Imagine learning that the woman who birthed you had tried to kill her other children, that your very existence was part of a twisted plan to manipulate public opinion and avoid conviction. Becky's life became a parallel tragedy, carrying the legacy of a murderer's blood while trying to carve an identity separate from it. When Becky finally confronted Diane in prison, it was not for forgiveness, but for answers. But, like everyone else, she was met with deflection and deception. "I didn't do it," Diane told her. "You'll understand one day." But Becky didn't understand. She walked out of the prison that day shattered, not because of what Diane said, but because of what she didn't. No apology, no truth, not even acknowledgement of pain. And that's the legacy Diane Downs left behind, not just broken lives, but a black hole where a mother's soul should have been. Today, Diane remains incarcerated at Central California Women's Facility, still writing letters, still filing appeals, still crafting stories in which she is the heroine. Her parole hearings continue to be exercises in futility, each one a reminder that justice is not just about punishment, but about memory, about keeping the truth alive against the onslaught of denial. Diane once said in an interview, "Everybody thinks I'm a monster, but I'm not. I'm just a mother who made a mistake." But that's the final, cruelest lie of all. Because what Diane did wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a decision. Calculated, cold, and catastrophic. A decision to value her desire over their lives. A decision to treat her children not as precious beings but as pawns in a game of romantic obsession. A decision to silence the laughter of a 7-year-old girl, the hope of a paralyzed toddler, and the voice of a daughter who would later whisper the truth that shattered her myth: Mom did it. And no matter how many lies she spins, no matter how many years pass, that one truth will remain louder than all her words. Diane Downs didn't just kill. She tried to rewrite what motherhood means, and in doing so, became one of the most terrifying reminders that sometimes, the monsters don't come from the shadows. Sometimes, they tuck you in at night and smile as they do. The morning of June 20th, 2001, in a quiet suburb of Houston, Texas, began like any other, but by mid-morning, 5 small bodies lay still in a bathtub, and the world would come to know the name Andrea Yates not as a mother, but as the woman who had done the unthinkable. The crime was so unfathomable that even seasoned officers wept at the scene. Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, 5 children aged 7 years to 6 months, had been drowned, one, by the very woman who had once cradled them, nursed them, read to them, prayed with them. The image of Andrea Yates is one that still haunts the American psyche, a pale, soft-spoken woman with hollow eyes, calmly calling 911 after taking her children's lives, whispering to the operator, "I just killed my children." She waited for the police, not in hysteria or anger, but in the vacant stillness of a soul that had long since sunk beneath the weight of untreated mental illness. And in the years that followed, America didn't just recoil from her act, they struggled to understand it, to place it in the messy, fragile space between madness and murder, between sorrow and sin. Because Andrea didn't kill out of vengeance, jealousy, or rage, she killed out of delusion. And perhaps that's what makes her story the most heartbreaking of them all. Andrea Yates had once dreamed of a large, loving family. A former nurse, she was brilliant, methodical, and deeply religious. She married Rusty Yates in 1993, and together, they set out to build the kind of Christian home they believed would lead to salvation. But the dream became a slow-moving nightmare. With each child, Andrea became more isolated, more exhausted, more mentally fragile. Their home became smaller and more chaotic. Rusty, believing that a life of simplicity and spiritual discipline would keep them close to God, moved the family into a converted bus for a time, away from distractions, away from help. But Andrea wasn't thriving in simplicity, she was drowning in silence. She suffered from postpartum depression after each birth, and eventually, full-blown psychosis. She began hearing voices. She believed she was sinful, that her children were becoming evil, that the devil was watching her through the television. In 1999, after the birth of her 4th child, Andrea attempted suicide, twice. She was hospitalized and prescribed antipsychotic medication. Doctors warned Rusty that another pregnancy could be catastrophic. But those warnings faded, the medications were stopped, and soon, baby Mary was born. And with her birth came the final, devastating descent. Andrea's mental state unraveled. She stopped speaking. She stared into space for hours. She filled notebooks with rambling prayers and visions of damnation. And no one, intervened in time. On that summer morning in 2001, Andrea waited until Rusty left for work, then locked the door, filled the bathtub, and called her children in one by one. She started with Paul. Then Luke. Then John. Then Mary, the baby. Finally, 7-year-old Noah walked into the room, saw his sister's body floating in the tub, and tried to run. Andrea caught him, dragged him back, and held him under until he too stopped moving. Then she gently laid all 5 bodies on the bed, side by side, as if tucking them in one last time. The horror of what she did was undeniable. but so too was the horror of how she got there, how a brilliant, once vibrant woman spiraled so far into untreated psychosis that she believed killing her children was saving them. In her delusion, she thought she was protecting them from eternal damnation. She believed that if they died before reaching the age of accountability, they would go to heaven, and that she alone would carry the burden of hell. It was a theology distorted by mental illness, a nightmare cloaked in the language of sacrifice. At her trial, Andrea's defense team didn't argue that she hadn't done it, they argued that she wasn't in her right mind. Psychiatric experts described her as deeply psychotic, suffering from severe postpartum mental illness that had gone untreated for years. But the prosecution pushed for murder. They wanted a conviction, a life sentence, a declaration that mothers do not get to kill and blame it on pain. And so the country watched, horrified and divided, as a woman who had lost everything, including her mind, was tried for murder. Initially, Andrea was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But the story didn't end there. Years later, it was revealed that expert witness Dr. Park Dietz, who had testified that Andrea had likely seen an episode of Law and Order featuring a similar crime, had fabricated that claim. No such episode existed. The conviction was overturned. In a retrial, Andrea was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a mental health facility, where she remains to this day. Andrea Yates's case forced a national conversation that many weren't ready for, about postpartum psychosis, about the invisible suffering of mothers, and about how quickly we as a society turn away from women in pain. The image of a mother is wrapped in angelic expectation. She is supposed to endure, to sacrifice, to love unconditionally. But when that ideal crumbles, when illness corrodes the soul, we don't always recognize what's happening until it's too late. Andrea's children weren't killed by hatred. They were killed by a broken brain, a mind drowning in hallucination and horror, a woman who thought she was saving them. And while nothing can ever justify what she did, there is a profound sadness in understanding it. Her surviving husband, Rusty, struggled for years with guilt, with public backlash, and with his own grief. He has since remarried and tried to rebuild a life. But the pain of that day has never left him. For many, Andrea remains a monster. For others, she is a tragic figure. But for everyone, her story is a cautionary tale, not just about mental illness, but about silence. About what happens when cries for help go unanswered. About how motherhood, when paired with isolation, untreated psychosis, and spiritual delusion, can become a crucible of horror. In her quiet hospital room, Andrea Yates now spends her days painting, reading scripture, and writing letters she never sends. She is not the same woman who drowned her children. But she remembers. And in that remembering, in that endless loop of loss, she serves a sentence far more haunting than any prison could offer. Because every time she closes her eyes, she sees their faces. And every morning, she wakes up knowing they are not beside her. She will live with that truth, not as a monster, not as a martyr, but as a mother who lost herself so completely that she lost the ones she loved most. In the stillness of a locked psychiatric hospital in Kerrville, Texas, Andrea Yates exists like a shadow, neither free nor forgotten, neither punished in the conventional sense nor redeemed in the eyes of the public. 2 decades have passed since that harrowing June morning when she drowned her 5 children in a bathtub, but the horror remains suspended in time, echoing through every discussion of maternal mental health, faith, and the fragile borders between love and delusion. Andrea is now a ghost of who she once was, no longer the exhausted young mother of 5 but a woman living in quiet, structured routines, her days shaped by therapy, medication, and long, aching silences. She spends her time painting, often creating images of nature, children, and biblical stories, works of both innocence and sorrow, as if her soul, too damaged for words, now speaks only through color and canvas. In those strokes, there are whispers of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and Mary, the 5 children whose lives were cut short by the woman who brought them into the world. The names themselves are heavy with meaning, drawn from Scripture, echoing a desire to raise a godly family. But in the end, those names became headlines, grave markers, memories etched in grief. Andrea didn't hate her children. That's what made her case so unbearable. She loved them with the kind of love that can become terrifying when filtered through madness. In the spiral of her untreated postpartum psychosis, Andrea believed she was saving them from Satan, from hell, from the corrupting influence of the world. Her logic, to the sane mind, is unfathomable. But to her, in that moment, it was divine duty. She believed that if she killed her children before they reached the age of accountability, their souls would be saved and granted eternity in heaven. She was willing to sacrifice herself, to rot in hell forever, if it meant they would be spared. That twisted theology, shaped by a lifetime of religious fundamentalism and severe mental illness, became her reality. The horror is not just in what she did, but in why she believed she had to. And in the aftermath, society struggled to understand, was Andrea a murderer, or a broken mind lost in a war of angels and demons no one else could see? In court, that question split the nation. On one side were those who believed justice meant punishment, that any woman who could kill her own flesh and blood should never be allowed the comfort of a hospital bed or the mercy of a medical defense. On the other side were those who saw in Andrea a systems failure, a woman begging for help in the language of silence and suicide attempts, ignored and pushed back into the very environment that caused her collapse. What people forget is that Andrea had screamed for help in every nonverbal way imaginable. She had been hospitalized. She had been medicated. Doctors had warned Rusty not to leave her alone with the children. But help, when it came, was fragmented, inconsistent, and often lost in the dogma of religious obedience and societal expectation. Andrea wasn't just battling psychosis, she was drowning in it, pulled under by hallucinations that told her she was a wicked mother, a cursed woman, a vessel for evil. And in her delusion, she thought the only way to protect her children from herself was to remove them from this world. After her original conviction of life in prison, Andrea's case unraveled due to false testimony about a fictional television episode that had never aired. The retrial didn't excuse what she had done, it sought to understand it. When the verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity was handed down, it wasn't a victory. It was a surrender to the terrifying reality that sometimes evil isn't born of cruelty, but of unchecked mental collapse. And it forced America to face something even harder to accept, that the face of a killer can also be the face of a mother who once kissed scraped knees and tucked children into bed with lullabies. Today, Andrea lives in the space between guilt and forgiveness, between memory and numbness. She no longer gives interviews. She doesn't seek publicity. Her life is one of quiet repetition, art therapy, medication, supervised recreation, spiritual counseling. Some say she finds peace in her faith. Others say she will never truly know peace again. Every year, on the anniversary of the children's deaths, she asks the staff to allow her to honor them quietly. She remembers their birthdays. She paints their faces. She writes them letters that she never sends. And maybe that's her real sentence, not just confinement, but remembrance. She is not free. Not in her mind. Not in her soul. And maybe that's justice in its own cruel, poetic form. Rusty Yates, the man who once built a life with Andrea, eventually divorced her, remarried, and tried to move forward. But in interviews, even years later, his voice trembles when he speaks of that day. He has said that he doesn't hate Andrea, that she was sick, that he failed to protect her, and in doing so, failed to protect their children. His grief is the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't shout, but hums through every breath. He lives with the knowledge that love wasn't enough. That faith, in its most extreme and isolating form, can become a poison when paired with mental illness. That even good intentions, when left untreated and unguided, can lead to tragedy. Andrea's case changed things. It sparked national awareness about postpartum psychosis, leading to reforms, advocacy, and deeper education among healthcare providers. Her story has become part of medical textbooks, law school debates, and psychiatric studies. And yet, despite all the words written and laws drafted, the image that lingers most is not legal or clinical, it's human. It's the image of a mother, trembling and vacant, holding her baby one last time before submerging her in water. It's the moment a 7-year-old boy, wise beyond his years, saw his sister's lifeless body and tried to flee, only to be caught by the woman he trusted most. That's the image that will haunt generations. Because what Andrea Yates did wasn't just a crime. It was the collapse of everything sacred. And in the final reckoning, Andrea isn't a monster in the traditional sense. She is not a cold-blooded killer like Diane Downs, nor a jealous wife like Clara Harris. She is something harder to label. A tragic figure. A broken mind. A mother whose love became confused with sacrifice, whose delusion made her believe that death was mercy. And that makes her story the most devastating of all. Because we want mothers to be protectors. We want them to be warriors of light. But Andrea Yates was a reminder that even the brightest light can flicker and fade, and in the dark, even a mother's love can lose its way. And as we close this journey through the haunting stories of mothers who crossed the line between nurture and destruction, we are left with questions that echo louder than any answers. How does love turn to violence? How does protection become pain? How does the one person meant to cradle you through the storm become the storm itself? These women were not born monsters. Many were broken, isolated, mentally unwell, drowning in expectations, betrayal, or delusion. But their actions left behind scars too deep for time to erase. They shattered the most sacred bond known to humanity, the bond between mother and child. And while we may never fully understand the depths of their choices, we must remember the faces of the innocent, the children who smiled with trust, laughed without fear, and went to sleep in the arms of the very person who would steal their last breath. This isn't just a story about murder. It's a story about silence, about systems that failed, about pain that was hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. Let these stories be a reminder that mental illness is real, that desperation wears many masks, and that even those who seem the strongest can break in the quietest of ways. But most of all, may we never forget the victims, those small voices forever silenced, whose stories now live through ours. Not in fear, but in remembrance, in warning, and in the hope that someday, no child will ever be lost to the darkness hiding behind a mother's eyes.